Hello, welcome everybody. Fergus Nichol here with the BBC's Business Matters. In a moment, our main headline. French officials have opened a terrorism investigation after a gunman opened fire in Strasbourg, killing at least 4 people. That's the updated casualty toll. We'll get an update shortly. Also, this half hour, the siege of Derna in Libya.
The situation was bad. The situation was awful. The city was bombed several times by airplanes that were outside of Libya, Egypt and Emirates, and even French airplanes. And the targets were civilians, sadly.
That was 2015. We'll bring you bang up to date with Libya. We'll ask why the world's forgotten about a country in which people are still dying, are still living in cities under siege, and nearly 8 years after Western governments helped overthrow Colonel Gaddafi, they've abandoned the Libyan people to militia rule. Nobody care about Libya anymore. Since the overthrow and murder of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in the summer of 2011, the country's degenerated into a confusing variety of rival governments and mutually hostile militias. Frederick Wary is a senior fellow in the Middle East programme at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Very roughly, there are 2 sides in this Libyan conflict. There's an unrecognized faction in eastern Libya that is under General Khalifa Haftar. He's a retired general who commands what he calls a Libyan National Army, which is really a collection of militias. So that's one side in the east. In the west, you have the internationally recognized government based in the capital of Tripoli that also draws support from multiple militias based in the west. Some of them in the past have had an Islamist orientation. So we're kind of split into these 2 halves. But, you know, in each side, there are multiple centers of power, multiple power brokers, multiple militias. And that's what makes it so complex.
Now, let's zoom in on one conflict zone, the city of Derna, which lies on the sea in the east of the country between Benghazi and the Egyptian border. We'll be back with Dr. Ware in a second. We're going to hear 2 short interviews right now. Derna has been under siege for the past couple of years because General Haftar, that Dr. Werner just talked to us about, says he needs to root out extremist groups lodged in the city. What this siege has produced, needless to say, is what Amnesty International's called this summer a city on the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe. Let's listen first to Jawhar Ali. He's a journalist from Derna, but he's been forced to leave the city to escape the dangers of the siege.
My city, sadly, had this conflict that led us to live in a bad situation. Before the latest war that began last May, we were living under a siege that continued for more than 2 years. That siege, sadly, blocked the citizens from going inside and outside of the city. And it has blockaded hospital aids and the fuel, and it has continued for over 30 months. And under that siege, the schools were closed. The situation was bad. The situation was awful.
Can I ask you about physical damage in the city?
At the same time of the siege, the city was bombed several times by airplanes that were outside of Libya, Egypt and Emirates, and even French airplanes. The city was bombed and the targets were civilians, sadly. I photographed and videoed many bombings. One of them in May 2015 targeted my neighborhood and more than 17 persons were killed. Among them were kids.
What's the situation now? Is the siege still in force, and who is directing it, if so?
In the late days of May until now, the city was attacked by Haftar's militias, who call themselves the army, that attacked the city and controlled the largest parts of it. Now this siege is targeting only a few hundred people who are located in the middle of the city, in the old city of Derna. They are blockaded from each and every side, and 3 people in the last week died of hunger because they cannot go outside. Because if they go outside, they will be killed.
General Haftar says that his militia, his army, whatever you call it, is pursuing extremists in the city.
Yes, in 2015, the city was under the control of ISIS. And the fighters who are in the city right now were the first one to fight and defeat ISIS. So the city was under the control of its civilians, its revolutionaries.
So just to be clear, ISIS was in Derna, but they've since left. There is another militia in the city, but they are simply one of the many militias and they are opposed to General Haftar. Is that right?
Exactly. They are revolutionaries. They announced many times that they want the city to be under the control of the Libyan government only if Libyans agreed on one government. They won't surrender or they won't give their weapons unless they give it to a government that all the Libyans agree on. So that's why they oppose Haftar. I know many of them under the siege inside the old city of Derna until now, and people die of hunger there, as I told you, and no one cares about them. And I hope that people who hear me now will do something to help those people who want to get out from the city. They want to survive only.
That's Jawhar Ali speaking from outside Derna. So where does his story fit into the bigger picture? Ali Abu Zakuk was involved in one of the rival factions that we heard about earlier. He's now based in the US. On the line to Washington, D.C., I asked him why peace between the factions has been so elusive.
I think the biggest obstacle is the personal ambitions of some actors. They are trying to utilize and exploit the situation for their own ends.
Who would you say were the worst offenders in that regard?
The renegade army man, Khalifa Haftar.
So former General Khalif...
He was not a former general, he was a former colonel.
Right. Where do you think he has served the people ill?
He began with Benghazi because that is the city that started the revolution. And for 4 years, he has decimated the city. The old city is destroyed. The revolutionary forces which were there were defeated. He had destroyed Benghazi and then turned on Derna and destroyed Derna in all the pretext of fighting, he called it terrorism, while actual facts showed that he was the one who has helped the ISIS forces when they were defeated from Derna to go to Sirte. He said to his forces, which has been doing a lot of extrajudicial killing, don't take prisoners, kill. This man is a war criminal, a man who should be sued by the international justice.
So who do you think has the best claim to lead a government in Libya?
I think the best way is to really start afresh with the new elections after the referendum of the new constitution, because we have been living in a transitional period now for 7 years and more.
What about all the militias that control territory beyond the reach of these would-be governments?
In Tripoli, there are 4 mafia or 4 militias that control the city. And the government of Faiz Sarraj, the government of National Accord, they call it, is protected supposedly by it. And then you have another rogue element supported by the Saudi intelligence. They are the ones who have destroyed the tombs and the places in the old Libya.
We heard from a young man who has fled Derna because of the siege you referred to, west to Misrata, and he said, look, the international community doesn't care anymore. Is he right?
I think reality has shown that they have put a blind eye to the crimes of Haftar in Derna and in Benghazi and elsewhere. They have not given the Libyan people an iota of help to really overcome these miserable situations.
That's Ali Abu Zakuk speaking from Washington. Let's go back to Frederick Weary, who's with the Carnegie Endowment. Frederick, is that right? Ali Abu Zakuk says the international community hasn't given an iota of help to Libya.
I think that's a huge part of the reason why Libya is facing this chaos, that the NATO-led intervention toppled Gaddafi, and there was just a real vacuum that opened up, and there was a real reluctance by the United States, by the Europeans to get involved, to do nation building. The international community wanted Libyans to do this on their own. And of course, unfortunately, what we've seen is the country has collapsed into these rivalries. Now, there are international efforts underway to broker a peace between those two sides that I mentioned. There's a lot of assistance efforts going on the ground through the UN, through the Europeans, to try to help Libyans in education, in media, civil society, helping people on the ground behind the scenes. So there is concern. I mean, we have to remember this country affects the security of the entire Mediterranean as well as the Middle East.
Thanks to Frederick